Peak Human.
Les humains à leur meilleur.
C'est tu apogeo.
ピーク人間
And welcome back. I'm Brian Sanders, and this is the Peak Human podcast that complements the Food Lies film as well as sapien.org. If you are new, please start back at the beginning. I've created this as an audio series where each episode features a different guest that puts another piece of the puzzle together. The order doesn't matter as much, so feel free to listen to this episode and then go back to the beginning. Today we're talking to Stephan Guyenet, who has a degree in biochemistry and a Ph.D. in neuroscience. He spent over 12 years in the neuroscience research world studying neurodegenerative disease and the neuroscience of body fatness. He wrote a great book called The Hungry Brain. He speaks at conferences, he's a senior fellow at GiveWell, and a scientific reviewer for the Examine.com Research Digest. He is definitely not a low-carb person, which is why I had him on. He has a lot of great ideas and is a great mind in the space of nutrition. It was very interesting to hear him talk about all the great benefits he did see when he ate a low-carb diet 11 years ago. Make sure to listen until the end when he talks about this. He has some problems with certain people and aspects of the low-carb community and is going on Joe Rogan's podcast soon to debate Gary Taubes on his views of the carbohydrate insulin theory of obesity and sugar being uniquely toxic. We had some disagreement on the recommended daily allowance of nutrients. He thinks what's recommended is all you need and getting more than that is pointless. I think this is wrong. I think he's basing it on studies of worthless, non-bioavailable vitamin C pills that in excess do nothing. So in that, I agree. I don't think there's any benefit to popping a bunch of these and think we're going to cure a cold. I do know that our ancestors got estimates of 10 to 28 times the amount of nutrients we get today, so there's a lot more to this discussion that we didn't have time to get into. We also disagreed on fiber, which led to some carnivore talk. He got some things wrong about the member of the Grateful Dead who was a carnivore. He said that he died at a young age of a heart attack. I looked into it and it turns out he was carnivore for 48 years and was in excellent health and died in a car accident at 72. He also said we don't have long-term studies on the safety of low-carb diets at the end. This isn't exactly true, and furthermore, we have hundreds of thousands of years of human populations living on low-carb diets to prove its safety and efficacy. He additionally mentions the low-carb community makes crazy claims that aren't based on science. I'm not sure what he's referring to. Not everything can be measured anyway. If tens of thousands of people report to their doctor they aren't hungry anymore, their energy is stable, their brain is working better, they aren't addicted to sugar, they finally have control of their food intake, etc., then this is some great clinical observation and patient anecdotes that add up to a lot. I think everyone has their own ideas about things and collects info to support their opinion. It's only natural, and I'm sure I'm doing it too, even though I'm trying not to. Everyone has to be in their camp and collect data and narratives to support their theories. He seemed to do this, as you'll see throughout the episode. I agreed with a lot of his points though, especially that humans didn't evolve to eat based on tracking macros and calories and using an Excel spreadsheet to figure out what to eat. He's doing great work and looking at this from a different angle, which is important. A lot of interesting stuff here, so let's get to it. But first I gotta mention the Food Lies film, which is in the last stretch of crowdfunding on Indiegogo. We really need your help to finish it. We have a bunch of cool perks like the Eat Meat t-shirt, the movie poster, bonus features, and more. Find it through foodlies.org or by clicking through this link in the show notes. I really appreciate it. And now here's Stephan Guyenet. Stephan Guyenet, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been following your work for a while.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, we should start right off with The Hungry Brain because that's a great book you wrote and that's a good starting point. Then we can see where it goes from there. Okay, so I love studying how we get fat and what to do about it, which is actually a Gary Taubes title of his book, which may be appropriate for what we're going to talk about later. But I'm just obsessed with that. You know, I'm making this film, doing this podcast, and it's all I want to know about. And you're one of the biggest researchers behind this. So why is the brain the biggest thing we should be looking at?
Yeah, there are a couple of different reasons, and some of them are just common sense, and some of them are kind of more wonky research based. But basically, if we think about the body, the brain is the central processing unit, right? It's the CPU, just like in your computer. It's the thing that kind of does all the processing and runs everything. And one of the things that it runs in particular is your behaviors. So, if you believe in science, then you believe that the brain generates all of your behaviors. So every piece of food that you put in your mouth is a behavior. The amount that you eat, the types of food that you choose to eat rather than other types, those are all behaviors. And so if you believe that, the quality and or the quantity of food that you eat has anything to do with your body fatness, then you have to believe that the brain is important. Furthermore, physical activity is a behavior that also relates to body weight. And another thing that a lot of people don't know as much about is that there are actually non-conscious control systems in the brain that regulate a lot of different physiological processes. For example, things like body temperature and heart rate. And of course, these are non-conscious things. You can't decide to lower your body temperature to, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And one of the things that these regulatory systems regulate is the amount of fat on your body. And there's a pretty well characterized system that does that. And we can talk about how that system works. But the main point is that, again, it's seated in the brain. All of these things, I don't want to say all of these things, but most of the kind of high level regulatory systems are located in the brain just because the brain, again, is specialized for computation. It's specialized for information processing. And these are tasks that require information processing because you're taking a bunch of inputs, you're processing them into appropriate outputs. So that's what the brain does best. So the other thing I want to mention that's a little bit more wonky is when we look at the genetics of human body fatness, we have these huge studies called genome-wide association studies that just look at hundreds of thousands or millions of people, and they try to figure out what regions in the human genome are associated with certain traits. And so, for example, you can say, hey, if you have an adenine or a guanine nucleotide at this particular genomic location, you're going to be slightly fatter than the next guy. Mm-hmm. So basically, you can figure out what genes are causing us to be fatter or thinner. And one of the things, and it's totally unbiased. That's one of the cool things about it. It's completely unbiased because you're just looking at the whole genome and seeing what pops up. You're not starting with hypotheses about what might be going on. And so one of the cool things about this is you can look at the genes that are coming up. You can look at the genes that are being identified and you can say, what do these genes do? And that gives you some insight into the biological processes that underlie the trait that you're studying. And so, for example, if you look at the genes that have to do with height, you'll see a bunch of genes that have to do with growth of the skeletal system, growth of connective tissues, that sort of thing. If you look at genes relating to diabetes, you'll see a bunch of genes that relate to the pancreas development and insulin secretion and insulin sensitivity. So what genes are involved when we look at body weight? Well, they're overwhelmingly genes that relate to brain activity, brain development, and brain function. So this tells us that the brain is really the linchpin in obesity. And so that's kind of why I took that perspective in my book, is that there's not really any other book that has taken such an explicit brain-centric perspective for body weight, which is interesting. And I'm saying there's no general audience popular books that have done that. Of course, there are academic books that have done that, but there's no general audience books, even though this is like the number one thing that, in my opinion, we should be focusing on if we want to understand the problem. So that was kind of the rationale.
Yeah, it really helped illuminate that side of things. And sort of a central idea of yours is nobody wants to overeat, but we all end up doing it. And that there's sort of like this mismatch between our modern environment and how we used to live. So I guess keep going on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is something that I use just to kind of illustrate to people that our eating behavior in large part is guided by non-conscious systems that doesn't always do what we want them to do. So, in the United States today, for example, over a third of people have obesity, over a third of adults have obesity, another third are overweight, and then less than a third are lean. And most of those people with obesity would rather not have obesity, right? Mm-hmm. And yet they are, and this is not to create blame, this is just to, understand the problem. They're engaging in behaviors that maintain that obesity, and people are engaging in behaviors that create that obesity, even though they don't want to be. Like, nobody wants to overeat, nobody wants to gain fat, nobody wants to develop health problems, and yet those are things that we do, not because, there's some moral failing or because we're weak or self-destructive or anything, but just because we have these systems in our brains that evolved to help our ancestors survive and thrive. And those things push us to eat more calories than we really should and to eat foods that are less healthy than we really should. And I don't know how deep you want to get into that. We can push forward if you want, but I'll just leave it there for now. And if you want to go deeper, we can.
Well, yeah. I mean, I love all this stuff. And I think we should talk about the specifics a bit on people listening to this podcast know by now that we had a long history of wanting calories, and calories were a good thing. And then now it's in abundance. So if you could just go into that evolutionary aspect for a second.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, to understand who we are today, we have to understand the environment that we evolved in. And the best way to do that is to look at current and historical hunter-gatherers that lived like our ancestors lived, or also, agriculturalists that lived like those ancestors lived, and see, what their lives are like. And if you look at how hunter-gatherers live, what you will see is that they have to work hard to get the food that they eat. And most hunter-gatherers they're not starving, they have good nutritional status, but they're not like drowning in food either. They have to work really hard to get their food. They have to climb trees to get honey. They have to walk 5+ miles a day to go forage for things. They have to run. They have to lift to hunt animals for their food. And so all of these things, basically, they're constantly battling. They're constantly fighting a fight against starvation. So they're constantly having to work really hard to avoid starvation. And to do that, you have to have motivational systems that push you hard enough to get those calories to fuel your body, or else you will not be motivated enough to run those 5 miles or to climb that tree or whatever, and you will die or you won't reproduce and, leave your genes behind. And so these principles they're not really that complicated, and they're things that have been modeled in a variety of different species. So biologists have modeled foraging behavior in a variety of different species. And what they find is that foraging behavior adheres to certain very simple principles that can be modeled mathematically. And they've put this together in an equation that I call the optimal foraging equation. It's very simple. It is the value of a food, and therefore how much effort we should expend to obtain it, is equal to the calories in that food minus the calorie cost of obtaining that food divided by time. So that's just the calorie return rate. Same way that you would calculate a return rate for any investment that you do. They are behaving according to a calorie return rate when they are selecting which resources to exploit and which resources not to exploit. And so, and of course, they're not doing this consciously, right? Like, a lion or a raccoon or whatever is not doing math in its head to figure out which resources to exploit. What should I eat, this piece of trash or that piece of trash? But this is all happening implicitly in the brain because their brains were crafted by natural selection to seek food efficiently, because that's what helped their ancestors survive. And so we have these things built into our brains, again, not consciously. We're not, pulling up an Excel spreadsheet whenever we have to figure out what we want to eat. But these things are built into our brains. And when anthropologists have looked for these same behaviors in hunter-gatherers, they've found that they apply in humans too. So humans also apply this optimal foraging equation, and you can actually predict with a reasonable degree of accuracy, not perfect, but with a reasonable degree of accuracy, which foods they're going to select in their environment by using this calorie return rate equation. So it really illustrates how important energy is, calories are, to the human brain, and how important they were to our ancestors, because our eating behavior, our food choice behavior evolved really revolving around acquiring enough energy. Because basically, if you're a hunter-gatherer and you're getting enough calories, you're going to be getting pretty much everything else. As long as you're getting enough calories and protein, all the vitamins and minerals are all going to fall into place.
They're eating all the whole foods.
Exactly, because they don't have white flour, they don't have sugar, they don't have refined oils. So everything they eat has tons of nutrition in it in terms of the vitamins and minerals. So yeah.
That was really interesting to me because we don't really have receptors for these vitamins and minerals except for sodium. And that's because it just came naturally.
Yeah, I mean that's what I speculate. I can't, it's always speculation for some of these things because we can't run experiments to recreate natural selection. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean we can observe that the only micronutrient that we can actually taste is sodium. I mean, it at the concentrations normally found in food, you can't taste riboflavin or, magnesium or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever. It's like you can't, if you eat a piece of broccoli, you won't be like, oh, this has a lot of magnesium, more than most broccoli has. You can't taste that stuff. But if you put more fat on something or more sugar on something or more glutamate, that, MSG umami flavor, you can taste that. We have receptors that link up to our brain consciously and that stimulate motivational circuits. And so, presumably, those are the nutrients that natural selection cared about enough to create our motivations around.
And also the optimum foraging theory, and a lot of this was based on Hadza. They went for meat, tubers, and honey. And I think you mentioned in the book, they didn't go for many leafy greens actually because they didn't have as many calories and it just wasn't as worth it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so one of the things that I think is important to convey to people is that our brains are constructed to be motivated by very specific chemical and physical properties of food. Some things in food motivate us and some are irrelevant and some demotivate us to eat. And vitamins and minerals are just not on that list except for salt. Salt's the one essential nutrient that is. But really what our brains are motivated by is the carbohydrate, the starch and the sugar and the fat and the protein and the glutamate, which is that meaty MSG flavor, and the salt. Those are the things that stimulate dopamine release in the brain and trigger our motivation to eat. Now, if our brains cared about vitamins and minerals more than anything, or if they cared at all, we would just be so into eating kale that we would just eat it plain. You would just be tearing leaves of kale off of the plants and eating them straight up without any salt or fat because it would be so delicious.
Yeah.
But that's not what we do. In fact, most kids hate kale and they won't learn to like it until after they've had it paired with fat and salt many, many times, until their brain learns to associate it with the fat and the salt, which are nutrients that are intrinsically motivating to the brain. And so basically, if you look at these nutrients that the brain actually cares about in a hardwired way, everything on that list that I mentioned except salt is a calorie containing nutrient. So basically, the brain evolved to be motivated by calorie containing foods. Another point I want to make just real quick is that up to a point, the higher the concentration of those nutrients in food, the fat and the starch and the sugar and the salt and the protein, the higher the concentration, the more dopamine is released in the brain and the greater the motivational response you get. So the more craving you get and the more you're likely to overeat it. And of course, that's only up to a point. Nobody wants to spoon pure salt or sugar into their mouth. There's something called the bliss point. That's the optimum. So you get up to that bliss point, it gets better and better. And then over the bliss point, it gets worse and worse. But once you combine different nutrients together and you put, say, the bliss point for sugar together with the bliss point for starch, together with the bliss point for fat in one food, then, we call that a brownie. And that is something that releases a lot of dopamine and gets people just way too fired up about it. And then we end up overeating. So that's kind of how the brain is wired, because those nutrients, again, were good for our ancestors. Those were the things that they needed to find and that they needed to ingest to survive and reproduce. But today, we're just too good at concentrating them and surrounding ourselves with foods that are like that. And that creates a motivational response that is excessive and causes us to eat more than is good for us. And that's not the only reason why we overeat, but that is a reason why we overeat. And it's a major one.
Yeah, well, I agree. And you like to talk about your food environment too, right? So you can control your food environment and not have these highly rewarding foods around.
Yeah, exactly. And, this is, to a large degree, it's kind of common sense. If you don't want to eat pizza, don't have it hanging around on the counter. But we can explain, in scientific terms, why that is. The reason is that once you've eaten pizza a certain number of times, again, the fat and the starch and the salt, those things create a motivational response in the brain, and your brain learns that when it smells the smell of pizza or when it sees the appearance of pizza, it knows that that predicts the availability of all this delicious nutrients in your belly. And so at that point, all you have to do is see it or smell it, and the motivational response is triggered to eat it. So that's a craving, is the common way of stating that motivational response. So now all you have to do is smell the pizza or smell the brownies or see it or whatever, and you're going to experience that craving that is really difficult for you to not eat it. And this is the same way, somebody who's trying to quit smoking, you don't leave cigarettes hanging around your house. You don't go into the convenience store where you normally buy cigarettes. You don't hang around your friends who are smoking. You don't go to that bar where you always smoke. And the reason is that, again, nicotine, just like calorie-dense foods, it releases dopamine in the brain and it reinforces behavior. And it causes all of these sensory cues, like the smell of smoke, like the location, the situations. It causes those to be triggers that tell your brain, hey, this substance is available, and it triggers that motivational response. And so the way you deal with that is you get rid of those triggers.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the same thing with food. You get rid of the sensory trigger of having the pizza on the counter, and not only is it just physically harder for you to eat pizza, but you actually will not crave it as much than if you have to sit there and look at it or smell it. And it's because of this motivational process. And yeah, so just having a clean food environment, or I should say a supportive food environment, that's what I like to say, is extremely helpful. I mean, if you can, at a minimum, make it so that there are not foods that are visible in your kitchen or around your house that are not consistent with your eating goals for yourself, that's going to be really helpful. But even better is if they're not in the house at all. Because if your brain knows that a food is really not an option, you probably aren't even going to crave it. Or at least you'll crave it a lot less than if in the back of your mind, your brain knows that there's that pint of ice cream in the freezer somewhere.
Yeah. You know that you're going to have to drive all over the store and the hurdle is too big. And you mentioned studies about this too, showing that they put foods in easy to see locations and hiding them, and people's behaviors changed.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I do have to say that particular study was conducted by Brian Wansink. The one I cited in my book was conducted by Brian Wansink, and I have to come clean that guy has gone down in flames for research misconduct. Yeah. So just to come clean about that. But I will say that, I mean, the principle has been broadly supported by other research, and it's just kind of common sense, right? I mean, the easier it is for you to eat the candy, the more candy you're going to eat. Yeah. It's not rocket science.
Yeah, this stuff is pretty simple. All right, so I wanted to go back to the family stuff and the genes you're talking about, because it's so genetic, but it's also your environment. How does that work? Because we know it's not all genetic, because you can see populations get obese very quickly or across all different types of populations or genes. So how does that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a really important issue to understand. And it's one that I think a lot of people can benefit from a little bit of explanation on this. So the first thing I'll say is that in a country like the United States or European countries or other affluent countries, about 70% of the differences in body fatness between individuals is accounted for by genetic factors. So the main reason why one person is lean and the other person has obesity is actually genetics. However, that doesn't mean that, how someone eats or how they live is not important. Basically, what it means is that almost everyone in those countries is living an unhealthy lifestyle and eating an unhealthy diet. And the ones that are susceptible to it genetically susceptible, are the ones that end up developing obesity. The ones that are not susceptible just stay lean, even though they're doing unhealthy things. Mm-hmm. And of course, that's not true of everyone, but I think that is true of most people. And that's why you see that it's mostly genetic in these analyses. However, obviously, the same people with not the same people, but, the same genetic lineages of people have gotten a lot fatter over the course of the last couple of generations. And there's absolutely no doubt about that. So these same people today that have obesity, if they had lived 200 years ago, they probably would not have had obesity. And so we have to acknowledge that there are very important environmental influences too. And basically my way of conceptualizing this is this. genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger. So if you have someone who's genetically susceptible to obesity, that doesn't necessarily mean that they will become obese. It only means that they will become obese if they are in an environment that promotes obesity. So if you have someone who's genetically susceptible, but they're in an environment that does not promote obesity, generally they will not have obesity. There may be some exceptions. Some people are just so genetically susceptible that it doesn't even matter. But I think those people are very few and far between. I think for most people who carry excess fat today, they probably would not have carried that same degree of excess fat 200 years ago, or particularly, 10,000 or 100,000 years ago. So genes, just because most differences between individuals in a country like the US is genetic, that doesn't mean that environment is not important. Both genes and environment are extremely important, and you can see the importance of each by looking at the problem through those two different lenses that I just applied.
Yeah, I think that's helpful for people so they know that they can control their environment and it's not all the genes. And I think a lot of things are like that these days. We're finding out that these chronic diseases, it's the same thing. The gun can be loaded, but you don't have to pull the trigger. So that's great. And we should also talk about energy balance and hormones and stuff, because there's a lot going on there. Some people think calories in and calories out is bogus. Some people think obviously that's real. I don't think anyone who has spent any time actually looking at this thinks that it's not a real thing. But I think what matters more is what is the other context around there. And that doesn't tell me what I should be doing. Right? Just telling me that eat less food and move more doesn't help me. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think it's always helpful to define what one means by calories in, calories out, because that phrase is used in different contexts to mean different things. But just to make it more specific, basically what is true is that the number of calories entering your body versus leaving is the primary determinant of the amount of fat in your body. And there are tons of experiments showing that. And it's also just it's not even just obesity science, it's just arithmetic. If energy is entering your body and not leaving, the energy content of your body has to be increasing, right? And there's really only one place where energy can accumulate in your body, and that's your fat tissue. That's the only place where you can accumulate substantial amounts of energy. And so it's really just kind of arithmetic more than anything. But as you said, that doesn't necessarily translate into just eat less, move more if you want to change your body weight. Now, there are people who do just eat less and move more and do lose weight and do it successfully. However, and so, I don't want to knock that approach for the people that it works for, but that's not, I feel that that's probably not the most, it's not the easiest approach. It's not the most sustainable approach for most people. So I think, and the problem is that, we didn't evolve to regulate our eating that way. That's not the natural way of interacting with food for a human. The natural way of interacting with food for a human is not to, have an Excel spreadsheet where you're trying to balance your calorie intake and your calorie expenditure, right? I mean, our ancestors did not even think about these things. They didn't know any of what we know about it, and yet they remained lean. So there are systems in the body, if you let them function properly, that will do that automatically. And so that's kind of the way that I see it, is we should be trying to create an environment that empowers those systems to do what they're supposed to do, instead of imposing this kind of top-down control on those systems and trying to use willpower all the time. Because the problem with that is that it's finite, yeah, you can choose to eat half as much for one meal, but doing that day in and day out for the rest of your life, that's going to be pretty tough.
It's impossible.
I think for most people, it would be impossible. And so, or, let's say even just eating 20 or 30% less, I think that's going to be difficult for most people. So having, doing something different where you change which types of foods you're eating, or you change your food environment, or you increase your physical activity level, or you mess with your sleep and stress, and you're actually directly targeting these systems that are causing you to overeat to begin with and giving them better cues. And then your appetite naturally goes down. You literally just want to eat less and feel satisfied with less. that's kind of the approach that I prefer because, again, you're working through these natural channels of appetite regulation that are the thing that is most comfortable and sustainable for us. And, that just leads to better results over time.
Yeah, I think if you're eating whole foods, you will naturally regulate your body weight, which is what people have done for all of history. And if you're eating the modern processed foods, one of the only ways to combat the excess eating that usually occurs is by just cutting calories. So if you just want to eat your normal diet of processed modern foods, it's almost like you're going to have to be hungry. And that's why so many diets fail. But if you change your eating behaviors and just eat the whole foods that are naturally regulating your satiety, you just don't even have to think about it.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think in this regard, there's an experiment that is kind of interesting and relevant. And, N=1 study conducted by Mark Haub. I think he's at Kansas State. Anyway, basically what he did was he ate a diet that was almost nothing but junk food. He ate a little bit of vegetables and a little bit of protein and took some vitamin pills. But other than that, it was like Twinkies and soda and stuff like that. But he ate fewer calories than what his body required. Mm-hmm. And on that diet, he lost a substantial amount of weight. He lost like 27 pounds. His waist circumference declined. All of his metabolic markers improved. It's pretty amazing, actually. Like, if he had gone into his cardiologist or endocrinologist's office after that, they'd be giving him high fives because all of his blood lipids were better and blood glucose was better. And so, the calorie intake really, really does matter. But the problem is that it's just not the most sustainable way to do it. If you're eating that kind of food, you're going to have a really hard time actually sticking to that lower calorie intake. And, this is one of the reasons why, if you look at the interviews with him, he was like, no, I'm not recommending that people do this. I'm not suggesting that this is the right way to lose weight. I was just trying to demonstrate this principle, this scientific principle. And so, I think that's an interesting illustration of the fact that calories really matter, but just because they're so influential does not necessarily mean that just consciously cutting calories is the best way to proceed.
Yeah. So there's two things that are huge, I think. One is your satiety, how full you are when you're eating those foods. And two is the nutrient density. Right. Yeah, he lost weight, but is he going to be healthy long term? And, what kind of vitamins and minerals was he getting? So what is your definition of nutrient density? Do you have one? Or, you know what I mean? Like just thinking about what we should be eating, because I'm really into nutrient density. I think that's the utmost importance. Like you can have carbs and fat wars, but when it comes down to it, we should probably be eating like our ancestors that had a much more nutrient dense diet.
Yeah. I guess I don't really have a definition of it aside from just, higher levels of micronutrients per unit calorie. I guess I'm not sure if you're getting at something more specific.
Well, I guess there's bioavailability too, where plant foods have a lower bioavailability of these nutrients. And do you think we should be doing it per calorie?
I think ultimately the calories matter because we don't want to overconsume calories to get all the micronutrients we need. But at the same time, I don't know. I guess it depends on the food really, because if you're talking about foods that have very few calories like kale, if you do it per calorie, they look, insanely nutrient dense, but you can't necessarily eat 100 calories worth of kale. Like that would be a lot of kale. So it's not necessarily realistic. Yeah. So you probably have to do it depending on the food.
Yeah, I guess so. Well, also just it looks so nutrient dense because maybe you're not really getting all those nutrients from the kale.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Bioavailability is an issue. I agree with that. It depends on the nutrient with the kale. Some of them are quite bioavailable, some are not. And then it also depends on whether you're eating fat with it or not. So if you're eating fat with it, you're going to get higher bioavailability of some of those fat-soluble vitamins that are in it. I agree with the bioavailability question. But the other thing I think to keep in mind is that there's not really a whole lot of evidence that there's a benefit to exceeding micronutrient requirements. So like if you're getting, 100% of your requirement for, let's say like vitamin C, there's very little evidence that getting 200 or 300% is going to benefit you more than just meeting your needs. And so I guess that would be the caveat that I would put, in my opinion, on the nutrient density issue is Like, yes, it's important to hit all of our nutrient requirements, but by doubling or tripling our micronutrient requirements, we're not necessarily going to get additional benefit.
Huh. I don't know if I agree with that one. Why do you think our ancestors were so healthy? Aside from the obvious, they're not eating junk food, they're moving around. But do you think that they were doing better?
Well, yeah, so let me clarify. I think to get more specific, we can break nutrients down into essential and non-essential nutrients. So vitamins and minerals are essential nutrients, or at least essential vitamins and minerals are essential nutrients. And then there are all these other things that are non-essential but might be health promoting. Things like polyphenols, the colorful compounds that are found in plants, things like different types of fibers that are found in plant foods that affect our gut microbiota and the short chain fatty acids that we absorb. And so there are actually a lot of non-essential nutrients that are probably pretty influential to human health. And I think with those things, probably higher density of those probably is a good thing up to fairly large amounts. Like if you look at the Hadza, for example, that hunter-gatherer tribe that you mentioned earlier, they eat something like 100 to 150 grams of fiber per day, whereas the average American eats like 15 grams, and recommendations are somewhere around 25 or 30 grams. And so they're eating tons of dietary fiber. And so I think, I guess to come back around to the question you asked, I think that the higher levels of non-essential nutrients probably is one reason why they were healthier. But I think also another really big reason that I think is probably the number one reason that they are different from us in their body fatness and risk of chronic health conditions, the ones that we really care about, like diabetes and heart disease and to some degree cancer, is just their energy balance and body fatness. I mean, they were lean, they were physically active, and that has a huge impact on chronic disease risk. And you see this in a variety of different contexts. Like you saw it in Mark Haub's experiment that I mentioned. You see it in calorie restriction studies, like people's biomarkers improve dramatically when they're restricting their calories. You see it in primate studies that have been done on calorie restriction, where they've measured mortality and chronic disease incidence. So there's tons of evidence suggesting that energy, your calorie intake versus your calorie needs, is a huge determinant of your health and obviously your body fatness as well. And, I would even go so far as to say that I think that's the number one factor impacting our health in the modern world today.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's so huge. Figuring out what type of dietary strategy or lifestyle will get you there is so important, because that is the main thing, is keeping yourself lean or just in a sort of ideal range. And so quickly on the fiber thing, I know some populations are really healthy with a lot of fiber, but you can point to others that have very little fiber and are still healthy. And also, there's all these modern carnivore people showing that they can be very healthy without fiber. So what do you think about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, what I would emphasize is that health has a lot of things that plug into it. And, you shouldn't expect that one thing is going to be the cause of everything. And so, if you don't eat a lot of fiber, but you have other things in place, maybe you will still be healthy despite not eating a lot of fiber. Or maybe you'll be more susceptible to certain types of diseases that are more related to the microbiota, like autoimmune or inflammatory diseases, but not to, some other disorder. So, the thing about the carnivore diet, I'll just comment on that briefly. Obviously that causes weight loss, no question about that.
Yeah.
And as we were talking about, once you are lean, that's going to improve your risk of a variety of different conditions. And so I think there could be some benefit just by energy balance changes and body composition changes. But the other thing I'll say is that we really don't know what happens to these people in 10 years or 20 years. We don't know if they're, slowly developing cardiovascular disease or developing metabolic problems or increasing their cancer risk. We just don't have data. This is a really recent trend for people to be doing this. And some people might point to like the Inuit or Eskimo and say, hey, these people have been eating a high meat diet traditionally for a long time. And that's true. But I'll point out a couple of things. First of all, the Inuit were not carnivores. They were omnivores who ate mostly animal foods. They did eat a variety of plant foods. And the other thing is that, not only would they eat plant foods, but generally they would go really far out of their way to get plant foods, like just, picking tiny little berries in the Arctic tundra and, fishing seaweed out and fermenting these things together to preserve them for the winter so they could eat it throughout the winter, picking little greens and things, just like whatever, digging up rodent burrows to get little tiny tubers that the rodents would accumulate. Like this is the kind of stuff that they did to get plant foods because they were valuable nutritionally. So, or eating the stomach contents of caribou. That's another thing, like half digested lichens. Half-digested lichens in the stomach of a caribou. How delicious does that sound? So anyway.
No. I don't think that 100% carnivore is a good idea, really. But I think that you can go down the scale. So if the less junk you're eating, the less you need stuff, maybe like fiber or all these different polyphenols, right? So not saying that you don't need them at all, but just in the context, right? If you're eating a standard American diet and you're eating a bunch of sugar, flour, and oil and other things, maybe you do need a bunch of these antioxidants to kind of combat the bad things you're eating. But I think why a lot of carnivores are thriving is they're not getting any of the bad stuff. So they need less of these other good things, right? Their vitamin C need goes down, stuff like that.
Well, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question, but I will say that if you're eating, carnivores aside, if we're just talking about a whole food omnivorous diet, if you're avoiding the refined processed foods, then you are going to be eating higher fiber and higher polyphenol foods just because that's what's in unprocessed plant foods. So now, of course, carnivores is a different story. They're not eating plant foods, so that doesn't apply. But I think, again, we don't know what's going to happen to those people in 10 or 20 years. And I would say that I would have significant concerns personally about where they're going to end up. But not to say that I know for sure that it's harmful.
Have been doing it for a long time, and there's definitely people, 18 years, stuff like that.
Yeah, I believe that. But there's vegans who have been eating vegan for 30, 40 years and appear fine. So that doesn't necessarily, just because one individual did it doesn't necessarily mean that it's good for everybody. And so, we need to have something that's a little bit more scientific and objective before I would start to believe that it's healthy, and there are examples of people who had bad health outcomes on a carnivorous diet. There was that guy who was in the Grateful Dead. What was his name? The Bear or something. He ended up having a heart attack, and I forget what else he died of, but he died fairly young, and he ate a carnivore diet for a long time. So, and by the way, no matter, even if it's a healthy diet, you don't expect it to be like 100% protective of everything in everyone. So like, I don't think that anecdote's very informative either, but all I'm saying is that just the anecdotes are just that. But the other thing I want to say is that when you go to either end of the macronutrient extreme, whether it's the very high fat, very low carb or zero carb, or whether it's the very high carb, low fat, practically no fat, you see benefits on either one of those on either end of that spectrum. And so, the fact that they're eating this very extreme macronutrient diet, that's probably part of the reason why they're experiencing these benefits. On either end, you see weight loss, you see better metabolic health. And so I think basically the more extreme your diet is on the macronutrient scale, the more some of that magic is going to happen. So I don't think there's anything especially amazing about meat in particular, but I think the fact that they're only eating one thing is really controlling their calorie intake. And the fact that they're extreme on the macronutrient spectrum is also helping to control their calorie intake and probably has some metabolic benefits. And so the fact that they don't eat any fiber, again, that's one factor among many factors that contribute to health. And so it's possible that if you have other things lined up, you just don't need that. But I think in general, it's still true that in a, whole food omnivorous diet, you're going to want to eat a fair amount of fiber if you're trying to optimize your health. That's my opinion.
Okay. and people on different ends can do well. I've talked about that from day one, and it also goes back to your thing of the combining of the macros and all these flavors. And if you're separating out fat or carbs, it's less palatable, it's less desirable, so you're going to eat less. So there's a lot going on there. But I definitely wanted to talk about the carbohydrate insulin theory of obesity and what you're going to be talking about with Gary Taubes. And I guess, are you guys talking about specific about that? And are you talking about the adipose-centric model of obesity?
I would like to. Let me put it this way. I want to discuss his major ideas, and I think the audience wants us to discuss those things, but that's going to depend on Gary. But yeah, it certainly is my goal to, among other things, talk about some key pieces of his model and what the evidence for it against is, and debate that.
Yeah, so I know you had some criticism on the NUSI stuff. I read a little bit about that on your blog. Do you want to sort of recap that?
Sure. So I should start by saying that I think I initially got some of the story wrong. And I ended up correcting my initial blog post because I think I made some assumptions that were not correct initially, and we can discuss that as well. But basically in my initial blog post, what I did was so NUSI basically has essentially collapsed now. It's lost its funding. And the major funder was the Arnold Foundation. The Arnold Foundation has withdrawn. And the reasons for that are complex, but have a lot to do with the fact that Peter Attia left the organization. And Peter, I think, was an important part of the backbone of that organization. And so one of the reasons I think why the organization didn't function as well as it could have functioned is because it basically tried to get too involved in the science that the scientists were doing. So initially it brought on these scientists to do this research related to testing the insulin hypothesis. And the idea was to bring together the best top minds, and not necessarily people who agree with the insulin hypothesis, but just the best people to do these studies, which is great. That's definitely a laudable goal. And so everything started off well. But when things started to go downhill was when some results started to come in that were undermining the insulin hypothesis, which shouldn't have been a surprise to anybody because they were just consistent with the evidence that we've been getting for the last 30 years. It was the same story, but I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but what I do know happened is that they started really wanting to get involved in the interpretation of the science and the writing of the papers, and really started kind of interfering with the scientific process. And the scientists felt that their agreement had been breached in terms of, NUSI had told them that they would not be involved to that degree, and they were trying to get involved. And I think, by the way, a lot of this happened after Peter Attia left. That's my impression. So I don't want to put too much of it at the feet of Peter. He's a person that I respect, and we had some conversations about this that were informative. Another of the things that I was concerned about in my initial post was that people were getting paid big salaries at NUSI. Yeah, and especially Peter, but also, Gary and some others were, for the fact that it was a nonprofit, they were getting a lot of money. And I spoke to Peter about this, and I think this is really the thing that I got the most wrong in that post. And this is really the thing that I apologized about the most to Peter and others at the organization, is that, in fact, their salaries were set by an independent board that was using figures from consultants that specialize in nonprofit compensation. So everything was above board. They were not just paying themselves. And so that was one thing that I feel that I got significantly wrong, and I corrected in a subsequent post. But yeah, basically, my takeaway from it is that a lot of the folks at NUSI were just really, really attached to this carbohydrate hypothesis. Once the data started coming out, undermining it, they started flipping out and tried to find a way to spin it in a way that was not damaging to their idea by whatever means necessary. And I think that is basically the story. And I don't know how much that contributed to the collapse of NUSI, but I think it certainly contributed to it not fulfilling its mission as effectively as it could have.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I don't believe the insulin carbohydrate hypothesis. So I think they did some good work though, or I think Gary's done a lot of good work to help people stop eating carbs and sugar, maybe. So there's good things, but it seems like this idea is wrong. So can you kind of go over the adipocentric view or personal fat threshold, or what do you sort of support, which is the
That's
opposing theory?
one. Yeah, that's one way to look at it. So yeah, and by the way, I agree that, not everything Gary says is wrong. Obviously, there has to be some truth to it, or else it would not be as popular as it is. And I think
Yeah.
what's true about it is that carbohydrate is a contributor to body fatness, and eating less carbohydrate can cause people to lose weight and can probably cause, meaningful improvements in health as far as we're currently seeing in the research. So I think that part is true. And I think, if I can credit Gary for something, it's that his writing gave people permission to try a low carbohydrate diet. And some of those people benefited from trying that diet. And so I think that's what what I will give him as the positive. But, he constructed this entire enormous narrative around that, most of which is incorrect. And honestly, most of which is very easily demonstrated to be incorrect. All you have to do is spend like 5 minutes on Google Scholar looking into some of these ideas, and you're like, wow, this is so incredibly wrong. There's like literally dozens of randomized controlled trials showing that this is wrong. So anyway,
What's an example of that? Are you just saying that people can eat a high carb diet and lose weight, or
yeah, I'll give you two examples. So one of them is the idea that calories don't matter, only carbohydrate matters as a determinant of body fatness. Well, there are literally dozens of randomized controlled trials where they kept calorie intake constant and varied the amount of carbohydrate and fat in the diet. And what those trials found is that the carb to fat ratio does not matter, only the calories matter. Now, in a free living situation, of course, the amount of carbs or fat that you eat can affect how many calories you eat, but the effects are via the calories. But that's exactly the model that Gary argues against in his book.
I guess so. Yeah, well, okay, just to stop for a second. I don't deny that. I think maybe people get caught up in the real world situation. When it comes down to it, I agree. Carbs or fat, it doesn't really matter. It's just about the calories. But in the real world scenario,
yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think
different.
it is different because calories are not held constant in the real world. And so, the carbohydrate and the fat, those things can affect how many calories you eat. So, but this is what I'm trying to say is that obviously when Gary says, if you eat a low carb diet, you'll lose fat. Yeah, he's right about that in most people. But the reason he's right is incorrect. And at the same time that he is saying these things that are incorrect, he is spreading a really corrosive attitude toward researchers and public health professionals by saying, basically these guys are idiots. They, don't know how to do science. When in reality, what they're saying is actually correct. And he's the one that's wrong, but he's just kind of being a jerk about it. And so that's just one example. Another example is the physical activity. One of the things that he says in his book is that physical activity, exercise, does not cause weight loss. It just makes you hungrier. And again, there are literally dozens of randomized controlled trials showing that exercise causes weight loss. And, it's not a silver bullet for obesity. Most people are not, the average person with obesity is not going to be able to completely reverse their obesity with just exercise. But it is nevertheless true that it does cause weight loss. And the more exercise you do, the more weight loss it causes in many, many randomized controlled trials.
Yeah.
So, and by the way, that's not necessarily even true for every single individual, but on average, that is true. And there's like so much evidence on this that to claim otherwise just strikes me as bizarre. And yeah, okay. So anyway, that's just to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, where like 5 minutes of Google search can make you understand that this idea is wrong. But to take a step back, so his model is basically that everything revolves around factors that are happening in fat tissue, and particularly the action of insulin on fat tissue. So insulin affects the trafficking of fat in and out of fat cells. When insulin is high, it tends to suppress fat release from fat cells. tends to suppress fat oxidation in the body, in other words, fat burning. And so basically he says, well, we should be focusing on this as the primary determinant of body fatness, and appetite and, hunger and metabolic rate and everything else is all downstream of what's happening at the fat cell. Because if you're not having enough fat releasing from your fat cells, then your brain's going to make you feel hungry, you're going to feel sluggish, your metabolic rate's going to go down, etc. The alternative model, the one that I believe and the one that my field believes, is that these things are not regulated primarily at the level of fat tissue. They're regulated by the brain. And the brain contains literally the only known body fat regulatory system in the body. There's no other system that actually regulates the amount of fat on your body that we know of to science. There's not one in the pancreas. There's not one in fat tissue, as far as we know. And so that's kind of the different model, is that the brain is regulating body fatness, but also that it's not just about regulation, that body fatness is regulated, but sometimes we eat too much for reasons that have nothing to do with regulation. We eat too much because it tastes good. We take in too many calories because we're drinking alcohol and we enjoy drinking alcohol. We eat too much because it's convenient. We eat too much because, at the end of a meal, the ice cream comes out and suddenly we're hungry again. None of this has anything to do with body fat regulation or what's happening in your fat cells. It just has to do with the context that you're in. And so anyway, so basically it's a brain-centric view that the brain is generating these outputs either through regulated processes or unregulated processes, and that's causing us to gain fat. So that's kind of the model that I'll be advocating for in our debate.
So what is that? Go into that a little bit more. Just how does the brain, what is it looking at?
Yeah, okay, let's talk about the body fat regulation system in the brain. There's evidence going all the way back to 1839 suggesting that the brain regulates body fatness. There was an Austrian professor named Bernard Mohr who did a brain autopsy on this woman who had suddenly developed extreme obesity. And he found that she had a tumor in a part of her brain called the hypothalamus. And now, after 100 and however many years, we've done tons of research and we understand how this works. It turns out that that's where the system is that regulates our body fatness. And if you damage it, it makes you super fat. Today, we call that hypothalamic obesity, and it still happens to people who get tumors in that part of the brain. Mm-hmm. And basically, the way the system works is kind of similar to your home thermostat. If you have your thermostat set to 70 and it's really cold outside, the cold air coming in is going to be constantly trying to push the temperature down in your house. And so when your temperature goes down to 69, your thermostat has a thermometer in it that detects the drop, and that drop triggers a compensatory response of heat to bring the temperature back up to 70. Mm-hmm. So this is called a negative feedback circuit or homeostatic regulation. It's a really basic concept in engineering, and we have tons of systems like that in our body. For example, we have a system that regulates our body temperature in a very similar way to how your thermostat works, except, of course, instead of just kicking on the heat, your brain engages a variety of different things like constricting the blood vessels in your skin to conserve heat, causing you to adopt a heat-conserving posture like crossing your arms and legs, shivering, brown fat activation, causing you to engage behaviors like going inside or turning up the heat, etc. And all of that stuff together is so effective that the brain can maintain your temperature within 1 degree Fahrenheit, no matter what the temperature is outside. Mm-hmm. And so we have a system like that works for body fat. It's not quite as precise as our temperature regulatory system, but similarly, your brain has a kind of set point, just like your thermostat, that it wants to keep you at in terms of the amount of body fat on your body. And the way the brain measures the amount of fat on your body is through a hormone called leptin. And this hormone is secreted by fat tissue proportionally to the amount of fat on your body. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you have. Leptin goes to the brain and tells the brain how much fat you have, just like your just like your thermostat measuring the temperature of your house. Mm-hmm. And then if your body fat starts to drop, your leptin drops, your brain gets wind of it, and it starts to engage these compensatory responses. Just like your thermostat turning the heat on in your house, your brain starts to increase your level of hunger, starts to increase your level of craving. It makes your brain start reacting more to foods, and it slows down your metabolic rate. And all of these things basically are trying to restore your body fat to what it was. So bring in more energy and let less energy escape the body and shunt all that extra back into your fat. And it's effective, basically. It's really hard to fight that system on a day-to-day basis. And this is why it's so hard to lose weight for people with obesity. A person who goes from obese to overweight, that person is not the same as someone who started out overweight, because that person is not at their set point, and they're going to have a much harder time maintaining that level of body fatness than someone who started out overweight, because the brain is going to try to fight it.
Get them back. Yeah.
Yeah. And so this feedback loop that I just described, that, we could get more complex with it. There's more factors that play into it, but that is the basic unit. That's the most important unit of this body fat regulatory system. And it's really weird, actually, in Gary's writing, because he never even acknowledges this huge amount of research explaining how this system works, even though he sometimes in his writing will refer to leptin deficient obese animals. There are these models of animals that are super obese because they don't have leptin or don't have the leptin receptor. These are models of obesity that he actually talks about in his books, but he never tells the reader that the reason they're fat is because they have defects in leptin signaling. He kind of like bait and switches over to insulin. And so leptin is the most important hormone in body fat regulation in humans, not insulin.
Yeah, I think leptin's huge. So what do you think insulin, how does that play a role? And do you get into this personal fat threshold stuff that I've been reading a lot about lately, that if you push over your personal fat threshold, that's when the chronic disease, the hyperinsulinemia starts, is that everyone has a different personal fat threshold, why people are skinny and still can get type 2 diabetes, or thin on the outside, fat on the inside, and why some obese people don't get these chronic diseases because they have a certain fat threshold that's not being met, and that insulin is just acting as a dam and kind of holding back the storage of fat in these cells. And yeah,
I think the idea makes a lot of sense. So the idea of insulin as a dam, I'm not as sure about that, but the idea that, and by the way, that idea makes a lot of sense to me too. It's just not something that I've looked into enough to really have a well-formed opinion on it. Certainly on the surface, it makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the personal fat threshold, yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me too. Certainly there's people with certain racial backgrounds that are a lot more susceptible to diabetes at lower levels of body fatness than others. And that would be, a ready explanation for it. There are studies suggesting that people who have genetic variants that allow them to store more fat in their fat cells actually tend to have lower rates of diabetes. People whose fat cells are just really good at taking up fat they have better metabolic health, because that extra fat sitting around in the bloodstream and accumulating in your other organs like your pancreas seems to be harmful. So basically, diabetes is a disorder of energy excess, fundamentally.
Yep.
So it's a disorder of energy excess at the cellular level. And what causes cellular excess? Well, normally if you're a lean, healthy person and you eat too much, if you eat too much food at a meal, your fat tissue is going to be pretty good at mopping up that extra energy. That's what it does. It mops up the extra energy and puts it where it should be, in storage in the fat tissue, and not where it shouldn't be, like circulating around in the blood and accumulating in our other organs. However, if you keep gaining fat, if you keep doing that over and over again, and you get to a certain level of body fatness, your fat becomes less effective at trapping that extra energy. And then it starts getting into your other organs, and it starts bathing all your cells in your body in this constant high level of energy. And eventually your cells start saying, I don't want this extra energy, and they start shutting down their energy transport. And one of the ways to do that is to become insulin resistant, because insulin is a signal that tells cells to take up energy. And so your cells are like, nope, I'm switching this off. I'm becoming insulin resistant. And then insulin resistance eventually leads to all kinds of bad stuff, like type 2 diabetes and other issues, probably cardiovascular disease, maybe cancer as well. So yeah, so basically that energy excess, and the better your fat tissue is at mopping up the energy excess, the longer you're going to be able to accumulate fat before you start experiencing these metabolic consequences. So yeah, I think that concept makes a lot of sense. As far as the idea of insulin as a dam, that basically your insulin is as high as it needs to be to hold back the fat, that makes a lot of sense to me conceptually, but I would need to look into it more to feel really confident about it. I'm not sure, despite the fact that it makes a lot of sense, I'm not sure whether there have been any actual experiments that have tested that.
Mm.
And I would like to, just because something makes sense doesn't necessarily mean it's true. So I need to look into it a little bit more.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And there are some studies that show some aspects of it, but I don't know if like directly can show that one aspect. But this whole concept kind of goes against the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis. It's kind of directly opposed to it, but I feel like there is some insulin aspects that still fit into it. So it's a problem of too much energy in general, like you're saying, and your overstuffed fat cells. But I think there's an aspect of people eating a less insulinogenic diet do better because they're not getting too much energy.
Well, I think that there are certainly, I think there are benefits that are directly attributable to reducing insulin secretion in people with the metabolic syndrome. So this is something that Gerald Reaven showed in his research, I feel pretty convincingly, that some of the problems of the metabolic syndrome, so just to remind people, metabolic syndrome is like the quintessential modern metabolic disorder where people have excess abdominal fat and high blood pressure and messed up blood lipids. Basically, it's a disorder that revolves around insulin resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And what he argued, and I think he's probably right, is that a lot of the problems that result from the metabolic syndrome are actually attributable to having too much circulating insulin. So if you can get that insulin down, then that can help with your blood pressure, that can help with your blood lipids, et cetera. And I think that's true. But he was very careful to separate the metabolic benefits from the body weight benefits. So he really never linked insulin reduction to weight reduction. In fact, he argued very strongly that it was not related. And I basically agree with him. I don't think there's a lot of evidence. And by the way, I don't want to say that it's impossible. I don't think we have smoking gun evidence to say that insulin reduction has nothing to do with weight loss.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm not aware of any really compelling evidence that the insulin reduction itself is the cause and of the weight reduction specifically. And so and I think there's some evidence suggesting that's probably not a major cause. Like, for example, if you look at low glycemic diet studies where they're not really trying to reduce total carbohydrate intake too much, but they're trying to focus on slower digesting carbohydrate that raises blood sugar and insulin less.
Mm-hmm.
And those diets really don't cause very much weight loss. They're not very effective for weight loss. And so, despite the fact that they're reducing insulin, they're not really reducing carbohydrate very much, and they're just not really doing much for weight. And so I am not really convinced that insulin itself is an important factor. However, I do think that, if you wake up one day and you say, hey, I'm going to eat an insulin lowering diet, I do think that diet will probably, if you, for example, eat a low carb diet, that diet will probably cause you to lose weight, but it's not necessarily because of the insulin. And to illustrate that, one of the examples I like to use is to illustrate the kind of, this idea that either end of the macronutrient spectrum can help people lose weight. Think about ice cream. Like, I don't know about you, but for me, ice cream is one of these foods that's like almost drug-like. It tastes so good.
For sure.
Yeah. And I think most people will resonate with that. Ice cream just tastes amazing. And I could eat that almost any time. Like I could be totally full after a meal and I'm just ready to eat like a ton of ice cream.
Yeah.
And it would be amazing. And, and so I don't keep it in the house normally. We have it occasionally. But imagine now ice cream without any sugar in it, like not sweet at all. It's just the fat. You probably, it probably tastes good, but you're not going to eat it after a big meal. You're not going to be like, yeah, I'm totally going to stuff down this pint of ice cream after I
Ew.
just ate these steak and potatoes. Like, it's not as motivating. And then the other way, if you imagine the ice cream without the fat, it's the same way. Like, fat-free ice cream, I don't even think I would want to eat that at all. Maybe
Mhm.
some people would enjoy it, but it's not nearly as good as the ice cream with the fat.
Yeah.
And so basically, when you have that combination of those two motivating factors together, the carbohydrate and the fat together, then suddenly you're really getting the dopamine spiking in the brain, and you're driving that food motivation, and you're even driving additional hunger, like the second stomach phenomenon. So I think that, to me, is like the simplest explanation of why low carb diets, or it's not the only explanation, but is a explanation for why low carb diets work and why low fat diets work. And so, and again, I can't say 100% sure that insulin has nothing to do with it, or that insulin reduction has nothing to do with it. But I guess I would say that we don't really need, there's not compelling evidence that it is involved, and we don't need to invoke that to explain the reduction in calorie intake and weight loss that occurs.
I kind of agree with that. I don't really care either way. You can kind of just see the results. There's other ways to explain it anyway. And also, so some foods cause a higher insulin spike than others, but do you think it's like the area under the curve is the same? And that these other foods, why it doesn't matter in the long run, say over the course of 24 hours, that just because a carbohydrate raises your insulin more initially, but maybe the area under the curve is the same?
Well, it's a good question. So the way that they calculate glycemic index is by taking the area under the curve for glucose. And so foods that have a high glycemic index cause a larger total release of glucose, or I should say a larger total increase in glucose than foods that have a low glycemic index.
Uh-huh.
And so those foods are also going to tend to cause a higher total insulin response area under the curve. And I don't know that it's necessarily like a perfect correlation, but they will tend to cause a larger total release of insulin. But I mean, I think there are certainly counterpoints you could make. Like, you could say that, okay, glycemic index of foods in isolation is not necessarily how it's going to play out in the context of a mixed meal. Or you could say that, different people react differently to different foods glycemically. So maybe that's too much variability and it's hard to detect effects. You could make critiques, certainly, but yeah, I don't know. I just think that there's not a whole lot of evidence supporting that. And, I think another example that I can give is the potato diet, or the potato
Yeah,
hack.
the potato hack. Yeah. It's so
Yeah.
interesting to me. I found out about that a year ago and it like threw me for a loop, and it sent me down a good path where I was questioning my earlier beliefs. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, that's cool. So potatoes are one of the highest glycemic and high insulinemic foods as well. So they cause a lot of glucose and insulin to be released. And they also happen to be one of the most filling foods per calorie. And when you eat nothing but potatoes, literally nothing but potatoes, generally people who carry excess fat, their calorie intake will drop and their body fat will start to decline pretty quickly. And I'm not saying, I'm not recommending this is something everybody should do, but it is something that some people do, and they do lose weight. And so I think, and there's multiple things going on with the
They're eating
potato
less
diet.
calories. I mean,
Yep.
I understand.
But if the higher insulin were the driver of higher calorie intake, then you would expect them to be just eating more calories and starving on the potato diet. But that's not what we see. We see the opposite. And so I think that's another piece of evidence suggesting that elevated insulin is not, at least it's not a major driver of our appetite or body fatness.
Oh, yeah. So, okay. So, yeah, I know you have to go in a second, but this kind of leads me to talk about metabolic flexibility. And I think it's all connected, where if you're used to burning carbs as fuel source, then you can burn those carbs, right? You can burn the glucose. And that's what's happening in the potato hack is you're not eating fat, so you're not storing much fat. But then if you're eating fat and carbs together, you have to burn the carbs before you can burn the fat. So then looking at all this, like, I don't really care either way. I'm trying to be on both sides. Like, just look at the science. I'm not choosing sides and saying this doesn't work. I could see why both ways of doing things work. But is there a better way? Is there an optimum way? And being metabolically flexible so that we can burn fat I think that's better personally, even though I'm not denying the science or that the other side works and that you can choose a side and you can do fine. But what do you think about that? Is that most people aren't really metabolically flexible and they can't. They're not good at burning fat because they're so used to burning carbs. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that metabolic flexibility is certainly a marker of healthy metabolism, but I think you can be metabolically inflexible on either end of the spectrum. So if all you do is eat fat and not carbohydrate, then you will be metabolically inflexible. If all you do is eat carbohydrate and not fat, then you may also be metabolically inflexible because your body does not have the ability to switch between those. It kind of loses the ability. And we see this when people, are on low carb diets for a long time and then they eat some carbohydrate and they measure their blood sugar, it's like through the roof. And that generally they will need a few days of adaptation to a higher carb diet before getting, a more normal blood sugar reading, assuming they don't have diabetes. And because their body has to readapt to being able to efficiently use that carbohydrate. So you can get metabolically inflexible on either end of the spectrum.
Definitely.
And yeah, I don't know how important metabolic flexibility per se is. It's certainly a marker of health, but I think that it seems to be a marker of insulin resistance more than anything. If you're not metabolically flexible, you're probably insulin resistant. And I don't know how much the metabolic flexibility itself matters versus the actual insulin sensitivity that is associated with it.
Huh. What are the ratios of foods do you eat, and have you ever been fat adapted?
Yeah, so I right now eat a fairly high carb diet. I don't know what the exact percentages are, but probably eating like something like 50, 60% fat, or sorry, 50, 60% carbohydrate, and then maybe 15. I'm eating a little bit more protein right now than usual, maybe like 18% protein, and then the rest fat. So probably more like 50% carbs and then 18% protein, and then the rest, maybe 32 fat. So I don't eat a lot of added fats. That's really what I'm not anti-fat at all, but I try to limit the added fats because they're very calorie dense and they increase palatability, increase calorie intake. But I'm not afraid of the fat that's in avocados or dairy or meat, eggs, things like that. I don't worry about that. So, and yes, I have been fat adapted. So I ate a low carb diet for about 6 months. And interestingly, that was actually right after I read Good Calories, Bad Calories. This was 11 years ago. And I was just like blown away.
That's cool.
And I was like, oh man, if I don't stop eating these carbs, I'm going to end up with diabetes or a heart attack. And so I ate a low carb diet for about 6 months and kind of gradually transitioned off of it.
And how did that go?
It was fine. I didn't really notice much of anything. My weight was about the same. My energy levels were similar. I was still doing my workouts and felt fine. I wasn't super low carb. I wasn't like ketogenic or anything. But I was probably, eating 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate a day, somewhere in that range, which is a lot less than I would normally eat.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you one thing that I did notice. One thing that I did notice is that I didn't feel like I was as tied to specific meal times. So like now that I'm on a higher carbohydrate diet, my body lets me know when it's mealtime. When I was on a lower carbohydrate diet, it was easier for me to skip meals. I just wouldn't have the same level of motivation at that specific time to eat. And also it was easier for me to fast. So I was doing 24-hour water fasts once a week at the time, and that was no big deal. But now that I'm eating a higher carbohydrate diet, it's a lot harder for me to do that. I experience a lot more brain fog when I do that.
Yeah.
And I think just boils down to when your body is accustomed to regularly getting carbohydrate, it wants to get that carbohydrate regularly. But when you're more adapted to burning fat, your body's fat supply is almost unlimited. Whether, even if you don't eat it from the diet, it can just come out of your fat tissue. And so there's not the same level of urgency to eat it on a regular basis. Even though my total calorie intake was about the same, there was not that urgency to eat it at specific time points. And I'm just presuming, I'm guessing that has to do with the fact that my body just wanted to get refueled on the carbs regularly. I'm not aware of research that supports that, but I know that's anecdotally what my experience was. And I know others have experienced that as well.
Yeah, well, there is research. These carbohydrates, the glucose is a quicker acting fuel, and your body needs it because it can't store that much of it. Well, I know you can store like 400 grams of glycogen in your muscles and liver, but you can store almost unlimited fat, as you mentioned. And well, yeah, I'm kind of getting it. I'm just wondering, like, I see all sides of this. I don't really care which side people do. I just think the fat adaptation seems a little better, right? You have these benefits of the sustained energy and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I totally understand why that kind of like not needing to have meal at specific times or being able to fast more easily. I can totally see how that would be helpful for appetite and weight management. And that occurred to me at the time too. I noticed that it wasn't a goal for me, but it was something that I noticed. But for me, ultimately, the diet that I eat is a convergence of a lot of different things, a lot of different goals that I'm trying to meet. So, some of those goals have to do with health. Some of them have to do with body fatness. Some of them have to do with muscularity. Some of them have to do with cost. Some of them are convenience. Some of them are taste. And then another important thing for me is I grow a lot of the food I eat. And so I want to be able to work the things into my diet that I'm growing.
Oh, wow.
And so I grow a lot of potatoes. I grow a lot of flour corn. I grow a lot of winter squash. And so that's actually one of the main reasons why my diet is so high carbohydrate is I'm just eating what I grow.
Interesting.
And so, yeah. And so that's what I'm just trying to make the point that it's, there are many different
factors. Yeah.
Yeah, there's many different factors that we're trying to optimize on when we select our food. And so even though I recognize that is advantageous, in certain scenarios, it would be advantageous to be more fat adapted. That's not necessarily going to be the optimal balance point for every person.
Yeah. And well, say you said that adding butter to things is energy dense. Well, isn't a potato energy dense too?
It's not actually. Potato is much less energy dense than butter.
Butter's ultra refined, but yeah.
Yeah, because basically, butter, you're taking the 3 or 4% of milk that is most calorie dense and concentrating it down into a solid substance. So you're concentrating the calorie of the milk that came out of the cow by, I don't know exactly how many fold, but at least 20 fold. And so, but with the potato, and really calorie density, all it is calories per gram of weight of food.
Mm-hmm.
And potatoes are mostly water. And so, if a food is 70, 80% water, then it's going to be lower calorie density than a food that's just a few percent water, like butter.
Butter, yeah.
And especially because fat contains 9 calories per gram and carbohydrate only contains 4. So those two factors together explain why potatoes are much less calorie dense than butter. Now, of course, there's many foods that are less calorie dense than potatoes. Yeah. Any kind of vegetable is going to be less calorie dense than a potato. But, relative to like the things that we think of as calorie dense, like fats or candies or, bacon or stuff like that, potatoes are lower calorie density.
Mm-hmm.
Or bread too. Potatoes are lower than bread.
Well, yeah, and things with water and fiber are just better to fill up your stomach and other things. But okay, to wrap it up, so why are people scared of a low carb diet? The media is attacking it. There's both sides can work. There's benefits. There's all kinds of factors. But what's the big pushback?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that there are probably some legitimate reasons and some reasons that are not legitimate. And I would say that some of the legitimate reasons are that we don't have a lot of long-term evidence on what happens to people when they eat a diet like that for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We don't have randomized controlled trials with hard endpoints like heart attacks or mortality or diabetes diagnoses and that sort of thing. Now, in fairness, I think most of the evidence we have suggests that it's not risky. It probably is, for most people that are going on, it's probably helping them, but we don't have that definitive evidence. And so I would say that's one legitimate point of pushback. Another kind of semi-legitimate point of pushback is that there's a lot of exaggeration and nonsense coming out of the low carbohydrate community right now. Like there's a lot of people who just not evidence-based that are angry and like yelling at scientists and public health officials and really promoting these non-evidence-based narratives. And it's really annoying. And so I think a lot of people are just like tired of getting yelled at in non-evidence-based ways, and they're pushing back. So I think that's kind of maybe semi-legitimate, because it's not really fair to the diet to criticize the diet because some people are saying, non-evidence-based things about it. But then I think also there's just a knee-jerk component to it. Like it's different. It's
goes against everything for the past 60 years, kind of.
Yeah, it does. And I think it is a significant reversal of information and attitudes. And there's always going to be, the old guard that just doesn't want to hear that. And the truth is that as the evidence has accumulated, it has been looking pretty positive for low carbohydrate diets. And, now we're getting more evidence on ketogenic diets, and the evidence is looking pretty positive on that. We have the Virta Health study that came out, which, I've nitpicked some of the wording that they've chosen to use in their marketing materials. But I mean, the truth is that the study is very encouraging. The results are very encouraging. And so I think as it's gaining legitimacy, as it's gaining followers, there's just going to be a resistance there from people who don't want to hear it. And I really don't want to be part of that. I really want to be part of the people who sees the evidence and just says, hey, look at this. This is telling us something new. Let's just incorporate this into our beliefs and move forward. And so that's what I'm trying to be. But certainly I think there are a lot of people who see that and are just like, I don't like this. This is not what I, have been telling people for 20 years, and I'm going to push back.
Yeah, you don't want to be wrong. Yeah, so your kind of recommendations is there's kind of two, well, don't let me put words in your mouth, but there's two different ways to do things, and you don't be afraid of a certain way of eating. And what is your recommendation? I think it's just don't eat hyperpalatable foods. Where do we go from here? Because the problem is we've had no success recommending this low-fat diet. And what do you think about that? And where can we go for the future?
Yeah, so I think that, I think it's important to differentiate between recommendations for individuals and recommendations for public health, because the truth is that nobody's following the dietary guidelines. Like if we actually had eaten according to the dietary guidelines, we probably would not have as much obesity as we have today, wouldn't have as much diabetes, wouldn't have as much cardiovascular disease. Because if you're actually following the letter and the spirit of those recommendations, you're eating a mostly whole food diet that is lower in sugar, lower in refined starch, lower in added fats, and lower in processed food.
Sounds like what you're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And you're getting more physical activity. You could quibble with some of the details of the advice, but if we had actually really followed that in letter and spirit, we would probably be leaner and healthier than we are today. But the truth is, if you look at what Americans are actually eating on average, of course, different people eat different things, but on average, we eat a really bad diet in this country that I don't think anybody would say is either consistent with the guidelines or anything close to slimming. In 2006, the single largest source of calories in the US diet was grain-based desserts like cake and cookies and pastries. And then, in the top 5, we have pizza, we have soda. So we're not eating anything. People aren't eating this because they think it's healthy. They're eating it because they like it and it's cheap and it's convenient. And so I think from a public health standpoint, it's really tough because you can tell people what to do, but they're not necessarily going to do it. Nobody's holding a gun to their head and saying you have to eat this way. Yeah. So that's tough. I think there are probably things we could do, but I think, one of the themes of my book is that just giving people the right information, telling them how to eat, whether it's a low carb diet or a low fat diet or a whole food or whatever the diet is, just giving them that information on a public health level is usually not enough to change behavior. It's not enough to make a difference. And the reason is that most people just won't take the advice.
Mhm.
And so I think what we have to do is we have to start making changes to our food environment in a way that meets people at the level where they are. You're not asking them to not eat the pizza that's right in front of them, basically, you know? And so create changes in our food environment where we have less food advertising, where maybe grocery stores are organized differently. Maybe we have bring back real home ec classes where we teach people how to cook, teach them how to
Yeah,
make
I'd love that.
whole foods from simple ingredients.
Yeah.
And basically, we treat this as a food environment problem and a skill problem instead of just saying, hey, this is what you should eat. Now go do it. I think we've shown that that's not really going to be an effective strategy. And then on an individual level, like I think the most basic advice I can eat is just eat a whole food, lower calorie density diet. Assuming that weight regulation is one of your concerns, eat a whole foods, lower calorie density diet. I think that's the number one thing I would say. Don't eat refined foods, don't eat processed foods, cook things from single ingredients in your kitchen, and hold off on the added fats and the sugars and the refined flours. And then you can also consider other types of diets. You could try a low carb diet, you could try a low fat diet and see which one works best for you. Certainly, if you're going to try a low fat diet, make sure it's a whole food diet. If you're just eating like low fat snack wells and rice cakes and things, you're probably not going to achieve your goals. Yeah. And so, and then there's a lot of other things. We touched on improving your food environment. You should be thinking about your sleep. You should be thinking about stress management. Those are your physical activity. Those are all things that plug into the equation.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And I really would just like to see a second dietary pattern option, right? I know they have this dietary pattern A, it's like this low fat thing, but I would just love to see a dietary pattern B where it's more like the low carb, and maybe people stick to it more because people tend to like to eat fat and glutamate and, this meaty flavor. So if we give them that option, then maybe they'll stick to it better.
Well, I think that would be an interesting experiment.
All right. Thank you so much. I'm so glad we spent some extra time on this. And where can people find you?
Yeah, so my website is stephanguyenet.com. If you don't feel like spelling that, you can go to wholehealthsource.org. That will take you to the same place. The main other place that I'm active is on Twitter. And actually, I'm a lot more active on Twitter these days than I have been on my website, although that will change in the near future. And also, my book is The Hungry Brain. You can find that either through my website or on Amazon.
Yeah, I'll link to that. I highly recommend it. Seriously, if you want to get a big picture of all this stuff, it's a great resource. And any other stuff you're working on for the future? Or?
Yeah, I'm working on a bunch of stuff. I mean, some things I can talk about, some I can't. One thing that I will say is that I wrote a systematic review paper recently on the relationship between fruit and calorie intake and body weight. So specifically whole fresh fruit, because, with all the concern that we have about sugar right now, some people are wondering whether we should eat less fruit. So I wanted to review the evidence on that. And basically, it suggests that fruit is not fattening. If anything, it's a little bit slimming. Not a silver bullet, but it probably is not fattening. And then I have a couple other projects that I can't quite discuss right now, but one of them is going to be dropping in mid-March.
Well, awesome. People follow you on Twitter. I'm sure we'll hear about it.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
And that's all, folks. Come back next week for some more hot food talk. Please support the Food Lies film by clicking through the link in the show notes or going to foodlies.org. Leave a review on your podcast app or iTunes for this podcast. It really helps. Follow along on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube by searching for Food Lies, and I'll catch you next time.